Hi, everybody, and welcome to a special one-on-one edition of Newsmakers TV. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Friday, September 13th, and despite the inauspiciousness of the date, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome to the program the most powerful person at Santa Barbara City Hall, Kelly McAdoo, our new city administrator. Kelly, thanks so much for coming. You arrived in May. I guess we can still call you the new administrator, or is the honeymoon already ended?
I'm hoping we can keep the honeymoon going for at least another few months.
Least, yeah, at least till after Tuesday, you get to stay.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, I have so much to ask you about, especially the latest iteration of the proposed master plan for State Street. But I do want to talk a little bit about your backstory and how you got there for those who may not have followed your arrival. So you grew up partly in New Jersey, partly in Kansas, back and forth, but you consider yourself a Jayhawk, I guess.
I do. Both my parents went to the University of Kansas and both grew up in Kansas. And although I spent most of my childhood in New Jersey, they thought it was very important for me to spend time in Kansas. So spent pretty much every summer there, and we still have farm there that we go back and sort of my happy place where I can go and relax a little bit every now and again.
Yeah, but you did attend a prep school, Mercersburg Academy, which is in Pennsylvania, a little bit north of Washington, D.C. What was that like? You were a boarding student, so you were away from home for most of the year for, I guess, your high school years anyway. What was that experience like?
It was fantastic. I think I've always, as my dad will probably say, I've always been a little bit of an independent child. And so it was, for me, it was the right opportunity to go and have an experience and probably really, for me, very formative. Just taught me a lot about the world. It was an interesting, mix of students, a lot of kids whose parents were involved in politics. We were close enough to DC that a lot of folks were involved in that. Had an opportunity while I was there to travel in Botswana and South Africa with one of my classmates. Whose parents worked for USAID in Botswana. And so sort of sparked an interest in me in international relations. And before I got into local government, was kind of on that pathway to go work for the State Department. And somehow I can tell that story later in the conversation, but ended up on the local government pathway instead. So
Yeah, well, and then you attended University of Kansas. You took your BA in political science, economics, and international studies. Boy, that's a mouthful. Going on there, and also earned a master's in public administration there. So that must have been when that pivot came somewhere between your BA and your master's in terms of your area of interest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think, as I started to get closer to graduation, the reality of, sort of traveling from country to country every couple of years. And, I wasn't right for where I was in my life at that time. And so I was kind of looking around and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I had an undergraduate professor in the political science department. He said, you should really look at the master's in public administration program. He's like, you can go do the local government thing. And then, he's like, I do budget research in Ukraine. And so, like, would love to have you work with me on research projects. There's so many opportunities, even in the local government sector, to really stay involved in international work. And as it turns out, I have, through the International City Managers Association, which is kind of our professional organization for city managers, I've been incredibly involved in our international committee. And so ICMA actually has maintained a number of contracts with the State Department, with USAID. We actually sent city managers into Afghanistan after the fall of the government there to train local governing councils, like Robert's Rules of Order. How do you run a local governing body meeting? And I've been chair of the international committee now. Gosh, I think it's about 5 years. I'll be stepping down from that in September, but have chaired that committee and have traveled and done work with local city manager organizations in India, Philippines, Romania, sort of all over the place. It's been a really unique opportunity.
And you always seem to find a city hall in whatever whatever foreign city you find yourself and take a selfie in front.
Yes. Well, every I think it's August 15th, it's City Hall Selfie Day, and it was started by an organization called the Emerging Local Government Leaders, and it's become a phenomenon. If the Parks and Recreation staff has, TV show has kind of gotten involved in City Hall Selfie has taken on a life of its own, and so it's a thing when you go to different, countries and cities and getting a picture in front of City Hall for sure.
That's very funny. And then you've after that you've had a series of local government executive positions in the Bay Area, in Palo Alto, Fremont. Unfortunately, you moved up the aesthetic ladder from Fremont to Hayward after that. How did that part of your journey happen? How did you get to the Bay Area?
Yeah, so after while I was in graduate school, I met the city manager of Fremont at the time, and she was also a Kansas grad. Kansas has a reputation for being training city managers. That's what they're known for in their master's program. They're actually ranked number 1 U.S. News and World Report in terms of the local urban management programs in the country. And so just the reputation of the program, and so was really fortunate that Jan Perkins, who has been recognized as an international leader in the city management field, hired me on as an intern out of graduate school, and I got to spend almost 7 years with her in Fremont, just sort of learning the ropes. I call it kind of my education in government, because I didn't just stay in the city manager's office, had time spent in community development department, the fire department, maintenance services, really learning the nuts and bolts of government and kind of what's going on in a city and how do cities work. And for me, that was really important because I knew I wanted to be a city manager. And I said, when I get back to the city manager's office, I want to have that credibility and that
Sure.
sort of the ground knowledge of what is going on in each of the departments.
So you actually know what you're talking about.
Sometimes I try. Depends on the week.
And you have one daughter who has recently started college, I guess, huh?
Yes, she took the first semester of her freshman year off to finish some sports competitions. So she started last January at the University of Lynchburg in Virginia, and just went back about 3 weeks ago to start her sophomore year. So super, she loves it back there. I'm very happy to be back on the East Coast. So.
And I read somewhere that you visited Santa Barbara with her sports competition. What sport was it she played?
She is a competitive equestrian, so she would. There's Desert Horse Park out in Thermal, and so it's a long drive. So we'd be down there in the winter times for competitions, and on the way home we'd stop here and sort of break up the drive a little bit on the way back up north. And so just really have fond memories of after those competitions, driving home with her, kind of debriefing from what happened and going forward. So yeah, she's competing for the equestrian team at Lynchburg now.
Wow.
So
Are you also a horsewoman?
yeah.
Because listen, I got 5 rescue horses. My wife keeps rescue, so I can get you a deal.
Oh, fantastic.
Adoption.
Well, if you need someone to care for the horses in the summer, I'm sure my daughter would love to come out and help out.
Wow. Yeah, well, okay, let's talk about that offline. All right. And how about Addison? Do you still have Addison?
Yes, Addison, my corgi, she is still around. She's about 7 years old now, and she has been joined in our family by Bailey, the dachshund mix. So we have Bailey's now about a year old. They are a hoot, and if you're ever on the east side, I apologize because they are the barkiest 2 dogs ever. So
you haven't met Henry. You have no, So, housing is like topic A, B, and C here in Santa Barbara. What was your experience like looking for housing, finding housing, and where are you living?
So I'm living on the east side. I'm right over by the junior high. I tell people I feel like I won the housing lottery. I just happened into really nice new construction, but obviously smaller than what I was living in the Bay Area and a little bit more expensive. But I did get a 2-car garage out of it, which apparently is remarkable and a small miracle. It's interesting. It is definitely, it takes a lot of work. And so, I spent a lot of time on Zillow and Craigslist and just sort of scouring listings and sending out emails and text messages. And it took me probably about a month to find something. And I'm just really fortunate. I have a great landlord. He's fantastic. And, it is, I think, I probably had a leg up because I had two experiences. They're like, oh, well, what do you do for a living? When potential landlords, and I'd say I'm the new city administrator for Santa Barbara, and they'd either go radio silent or they'd be really interested in having me live in their place. So it was sort of I'm like,
Yeah, yeah. There's some potholes here in front of the place. I wonder if you could,
Yeah, so it was great. And it was finding the right spot for me. I'm super happy where I am. I've got, it's 15-minute walk to the beach. I just close to downtown. I could walk to City Hall, but a little farther than I was used.
so,
I was a block and a half from City Hall in Hayward, so it was literally like I just would walk down the street to the office. So
where do you walk the dogs? You walk the dogs on the beach or where?
mostly at the junior high, the lovely grass and Ortega Park. So we spend a lot of time over there. It's good.
Nice, nice,
Yeah.
nice. Oh, and I'm sure you'll get an earful about Ortega too. Well, oh,
Yeah, we got plans for that. We got plans for that.
all right. Well, it's significant, I suppose, politically that you're the fourth person in this job since 2021, and hopefully we'll have a longer tenure. But I think more significant, you're the first person hired from outside of City Hall since Jim Armstrong back in 2001.
Mhm.
Just talk a little bit about, for people who may not know, what does the administrator do? What's the roles and responsibilities?
So it's the equivalent of a CEO of a corporation. I basically run a $500 million corporation, and the city council is basically the board of directors. It's a little different than the private sector, though, because when I make a decision, that's just when the conversation starts, because then the council has to ratify it, and then the community has to weigh in. So little different than being a private sector CEO, but if you're trying to think about kind of the equivalency of what the role entails, I am responsible for the hiring and firing of pretty much every employee in the organization, with the exception of the city attorney's office. She's appointed by the city council, and she appoints her own team. Responsible for preparing the annual budget. I also serve as city clerk and city treasurer. So, preparing for the elections, making sure all of the appropriate election filings are taken care of. We do have our city clerk services manager who kind of does the day-to-day work on that, but this role serves also as city clerk. And I call it like the best job if you have adult ADHD, because no day is is ever the same. And you get to do a little bit of everything. And so I love, what I love about the role is just the impact that I get to have on people's lives. People don't realize how much city government touches their day-to-day lives. You turn on your water, you have to call 911, you go through a traffic signal, the pedestrian crosswalk sign isn't working, the beach isn't clean. That is all run by the city. And so making sure that that is all running smoothly and effectively, because there's a whole series of services that I think people just take for granted. There's the special projects we see kind of up here at the tip of the iceberg, and then there's
Right.
all the stuff below the water that just has to run. And just, like, you want your water to turn on, you don't want, you want your toilet to flush, all of that stuff that just happens. And so making sure that there's enough resources, there's enough staffing, and all of that to make sure the operations run smoothly.
And that's in the best of times, not necessarily,
Mhm.
if we have a natural disaster, of course, which we, we have our share of.
We've had a few here, I've heard. So
And then you got a whole nother set of problems.
yeah.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about leadership and your philosophy of leadership, because I find it interesting. The first line of your Twitter bio is, can we please disrupt the conversation about local government? And that word disruption kind of runs through there a lot. You talk about conferences and podcasts and quotes from you about entrepreneurial culture within a bureaucratic organization. Hayward is redefining the way public sector entities should function in the 21st century. Modern lean innovation strategies. Have you been like greatly influenced by Silicon Valley? Just talk a little bit about that whole approach that you have.
Absolutely. It's really Silicon Valley, being in the Bay Area, it's fascinating to me how innovative these innovative companies are there. But when you look at sort of how local government operates, and it's completely diametrically opposed for the most part from for the philosophy that those companies have, and how those two things coexist in the same environment was really fascinating to me. And looking at like how obviously government is very different. We have different sort of purposes, roles, but I think some of the fundamental ways of doing business can be modified and taken from those innovative companies and transferred into the government sector. So I was really fortunate when I was working in Hayward, had an opportunity to go to an innovation workshop at Intuit, and got introduced to some of their internal innovation teams. They have a really interesting internal innovation program, and was actually able to bring on a company called Moves the Needle to Hayward. I think we were their first public sector client, and they actually came in and worked with us. We trained a cadre of staff within the organization who really sort of understood and sort of served as coaches in lean innovation, sort of based on the lean manufacturing, Lean Six Sigma model, but sort of tweaked a little bit for the tech world. And so it's now called Lean Startup, Lean Innovation. And it was really great. Just for me, the key piece of it is just talking to people. And I think in local government, a lot of times our staff are so scared to engage with the community because of negative feedback, criticism. We can't do pilot projects. We can't try things out or experiment because we're going to get criticized for wasting taxpayer dollars. And so it's sort of changing that dynamic. And I think, the key for that for me is empathy. And so when you have staff who are actually going out and walking down the street and talking to business owners or talking to residents, or, hey, what's going on here? Why are you experiencing this? And then bringing that back, it's a lot harder to criticize someone. It's like, hey, we heard this problem that you're having, and we're trying something out. As opposed to like, we just sat in City Hall and had a think tank and said, we think this solution will be fantastic. Let's implement. And then everyone's like, what the heck are you guys doing? And so it's sort of turning it on its head. And I think for me, at root, we are public servants. And so you have trying to remember that we are a public service agency first. And so that means, I want every employee, when they're dealing with a business owner, a homeowner, thinking about like, if this was my grandma, if this was my dad running this business, how would I want them to be treated? And sort of how can we work together to try and find solutions? We may not always be able to get to 100% yes, but even if we get to 50%, we're doing better than we were before.
That's so interesting. So if I hear what you're saying, it's almost like along with bureaucracy, there's also this fear-based attitude. Yeah, geez, we better not do that because we'll get sued or something else will happen. So you're really more focused on transparency or opening things up.
Exactly. And I think that's what I've found, just in my experiences in prior organizations, is the more you share and the more transparent you are, I think people feel more willing to let you as a government try things out in a different way. And I think that to me is crucial. So trying to figure out how do we share, my thought is like share as much information as we possibly can, without, violating the Brown Act or, confidentiality rules. So that's always been my philosophy.
Yeah. And what are the similarities and differences going from Hayward here? I know it's a full service city like Santa Barbara, but and also, kind of why Santa Barbara, why now for you?
Yeah. So Hayward and Santa Barbara are actually, very similar. I think in both, Hayward has Cal State East Bay main campus is in Hayward. We have UCSB here. Also have Chabot College. We have Santa Barbara City College. We both have airports, water and sewer utilities. So, police, fire, libraries. So very, very similar services. I would say, the difference is Santa Barbara being more of an island and being kind of the big fish in this smaller pond that's in this Central Coast area. Hayward was often overshadowed by Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco, and the things going on there. And so you kind of get to be in your little microcosm, and you don't get a lot of media of attention, and you just kind of do your job and do your things. And Hayward was very much a working class community, and incredibly diverse, recognized as the third most diverse city, I think, in the country in the 2020 census. And so, I think over 80 different languages spoken in homes in Hayward. So learning how do you provide services in a community that is that diverse. Also we have some of the highest pockets of poverty, the lowest income census tracts in the Bay Area in our community, coupled with the hills in Hayward, where we have a TPC golf course at Stonebrae Country Club. And so it was this interesting dichotomy. And I feel like Santa Barbara, there are some very, very similar trends, income dichotomies throughout the community, sort of the diversity and trying to address housing crisis, gentrification, kind of all of those themes. So that's just in terms of comparing the two communities. I think why Santa Barbara, why now? My daughter, I was never quiet about the fact that I wanted to work in at least one other city before I decided what else I was going to do in my life. And so I kind of shared with everyone, when she graduates high school, I'm going to look around and see what's available. And I had sort of a short list of cities that were interesting to me. Have always wanted to work more in a beach community, more tourist community, and have never really worked in Southern California. So that was interesting. So I had, a few cities on the list, Santa Monica, Long Beach, looking, and Santa Barbara was one of those cities. And it just happened to come up for open before I expected it. I was kind of hoping it'd be a couple of years after she graduated before relocating, but I was trying to move her back to college and move here at the same time. So it was quite an adventure last spring.
And of course, it's the city council. There was a nationwide search. A recruiter reached out to you, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd been talking to some friends and just kind of asking, people who are familiar with Santa Barbara and the job, and he heard I had been asking around. I've known him for a number of years, just through the profession. He's a former city manager, and so he reached out and said, "You should apply." And I said, "Oh, well, I wasn't thinking about it right this moment, but I will throw my name in the hat, in the ring." And I'm incredibly glad I did. It's been an amazing 3.5 months so far.
Yeah, and it seemed like they weren't all that. I mean, they were unhappy to lose you, and the mayor gave a really sort of a touching speech when they honored you when you left, and said, quote, extraordinary. You had an extraordinary term, and specifically mentioning some projects around homelessness and housing, and which I want to touch on. But
Mhm.
let's make a little news here first. The city council is going to get the latest iteration of the State Street Master Plan on Tuesday, and just going through the agenda. There's a couple things for all of us with State Street fatigue.
There's a few of you who have State Street fatigue, that's for
Talking about
sure.
this issue every Friday since the last ice age. But one thing that jumps out at me in this new iteration is it looks like you're proposing to open up the closed part to traffic, from Carrillo and above, or at least to one-way traffic. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think what I would say is a little different about this iteration of the master plan is it's coupled with an action plan. And I think where we've seen, there's been sort of this, at least my observation, there's been a dichotomy between the master planning process and these sort of monthly interim operations updates that have come to council, where we're like, let's try this, let's try that. But it hasn't, because we haven't sort of coalesced around what the long-term vision for the master plan is, we haven't been able to really do anything on State Street that is moving us towards that vision. And so I'm hopeful that on Tuesday, the council will say, yes, we like what the State Street Advisory Committee has brought forth. Here's a few tweaks here and there on the longer term vision of the master plan. that can go off and get its technical analyses done, the circulation, the economic feasibility. There may be some tweaks that need to happen, but then the next thing people will see is the draft plan. And then in the meantime, what I have heard loud and clear is like, we need to do something, like something needs to happen on State
Yeah, the
Street.
mayor may have mentioned that once or twice.
I think everyone has mentioned it once or twice, like, please just do something. And so that's where you'll see the attachment to the staff report is this action plan. It's a sort of compilation of things that I've heard, things that staff have heard and have already been working on, sort of put in one place so that we have, like, here's some things that are going to help move us towards the vision in the master plan. So that includes reopening the blocks above Carrillo to traffic, trying out some different sidewalk layout concepts in the 500 block, and putting some timelines around those. And so what we're hoping will happen is now, sort of monthly or every other month, we'll come to council and do an update on this action plan and the things that are happening in there. So that's the goal.
So the 500 through to 900 blocks, essentially the quote unquote promenade in the new master plan. You would be trying different things out there in terms of, dare I say it, bikes and bicycle traffic. What does that look like? Or what
So I
is,
think there's, bike safety has been a key concern we have heard. I think the e-bike situation is out of hand on State Street, and I think part of it is there's just not enough other activity, and the bikes have this very wide space to, they don't just stay in their little center bike lane to go down the street.
yes,
It's
I've noticed that.
Yes. So, looking at things like how do we, do we create or, even like kind of physically separate the bikes from where the extended sidewalks would come out, creating some different surface material on the street, creating that physical separation between the bikes, potentially creating walk your bike zones, on the weekends. So it really is pedestrian only. And I think, the long-term vision is that these streets would become kind of this flat and flexible surface. So it's all unified, but you'd have texture differences and you'd have material differences. So like, here's where the bikes belong, here's where the pedestrians belong. Right now, it's very confusing, I think, to everyone and so I think that's the long-term vision. And then obviously that still allows for public safety access and sort of getting rid of the concrete planters at the end of the blocks and actually installing kind of the automatic up and down, bollards potentially that could allow easy public safety access, vehicle delivery truck access. I mean, that's kind of the longer term vision for how those streets would operate.
And how much of that is what you just described is long-term, and how much would be in this sort of short-term experimental phase?
Yeah, so most of that is sort of a longer term. Obviously, there's some capital costs. A lot of it will be dependent on Paseo Nuevo and kind of how that redevelopment comes along. So we can talk about that in a little bit. But what are their needs in terms of circulation? That'll help determine kind of what happens on the 900 block. And I think in the meantime, it's an opportunity to try some stuff out. It's like, if we put different surface treatments on where the pedestrians are supposed to go, does that help slow the bikes down? And trying out some sort of temporary things to test out this theory about how to slow bikes down.
Yeah. What about this issue of the cost of for the stormwater runoff, which is a big deal for development of housing, obviously. Where are we on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, couple things. One, we need to, once we know what the sort of plan is for the street structure, and kind of that'll help us define sort of a magnitude of cost for the stormwater infrastructure. I think there's a secondary piece of the stormwater infrastructure that's also helping support businesses and property owners along State Street who actually can't install mitigation measures on their property. So part of the action plan, there's two things that we're going to start initiating. One is looking at an enhanced infrastructure financing district, which is kind of like redevelopment 2.0, but it only takes tax increment from the city and potentially the county's property tax. And that basically could enable a mechanism for, you basically would finance against the future improvements in property tax from the redevelopment is how that, loosely how that system works.
Right.
And so that could be a way that we finance some of those public infrastructure improvements that would help both a housing from a business owner's perspective. The other piece is we're looking at the stormwater requirements. It is interesting, I've gotten way in the weeds on this now. But when you look at kind of the state, everyone sort of says, oh, Santa Barbara has the really strict stormwater requirements. If you're at the highest tier, we're actually the same as the state. The state requirements and the highest tier at tier 4 in Santa Barbara are the same. Tier 3 is where we differ. So Santa Barbara has adopted more stringent stormwater management requirements than the state requirements at tier 3. So if we want to incentivize businesses and redevelopment on State Street, do we look at those requirements? That's one piece. I think the second is there an opportunity to do like an in lieu fee program where businesses or property owners can pay into the stormwater management program as a system versus having to spend, thousands of dollars on their own property trying to figure out how to meet the requirements. So we're exploring all of those. Those will come back to council for further discussion. There's a lot of ideas around that. So super excited. The staff team has been really creative in some of the thinking around it, and just excited to continue that conversation.
Is there a price tag attached to any of this yet?
Not yet. We haven't, and that's the sort of second piece is once we've landed on the master plan concept is doing the cost analysis of kind of what the infrastructure improvements would cost, and then, not just the street changes, but also the stormwater management pieces as well.
Yeah, but no Fiesta parade.
I think there's a lot that as I understand it, there is just a feeling that parade is not appropriate, given the scale of State Street. And, I think the city recommends continuing that on Cabrillo. We are looking at reopening State Street to some other, maybe just pedestrian only parades potentially. And I think one of the ideas that has come out in the conversation is creating some pre-designated parade routes that are sort of, so each organization that wants to do a parade, it's like, okay, what do you want to do in your parade? Who's going to be in it? Do you have cars? What are and so it's like, oh, that kind of fits in this route over here. We already know what the public safety plan is. We already know what the access plan is. And so really having a staff team work with some of our special event organizers and sort of laying out a few different sort of preset parade routes that could be leveraged in the future.
Okay. I mean, this is kind of a broad question, but what about retail on State Street? Obviously, there's, cultural, macroeconomic trends, other things affecting retail. But, how does any of this fit with I don't know, bringing retail back or not bringing retail back, or what's your kind of perspective on that?
Well, I mean, I will say, and I've said this in a couple other settings, is, most other cities in California would kill to have the downtown that Santa Barbara currently has. I mean, we still have a Lululemon, we still have an Apple store on State Street, and I think there's some
Two cultural markers of the 21st
right.
century. Yeah.
So, but it's I think, and if you were out on State Street over Labor Day weekend, it was packed and it was great. So I think the frustration is like locals, like where do we shop? How do we get there? How does the circulation work? And so that becomes all part of the puzzle. And it's interesting talking to some folks. It's like the retailers that want to come in, they just want certainty. They just want to know kind of what is the long-term plan, what's going to happen here. If I invest in doing tenant improvements in this building, you're not going to come in and like basically totally mess up the street. And so as long as there's certainty around what's happening, people can adapt to that. At least that's what I've heard in my conversations with folks. I think the stormwater mitigation discussion is also really important because we've heard that, as restaurants are coming in or sort of more small, not national retailers, but smaller retailers who want to come in, those permit requirements can be pretty cost prohibitive. And so looking at alternative means of compliance and how do we help small businesses. And so one of the parts of the action plan is really to do sort of a deep dive with some of our real estate community, some of our property owners, and what are like the 1 to 3 like worst pain points that your future tenants are having as they come in. Is it the permitting process? Is it the stormwater requirements? What is it? And so trying to identify what those are and then come up with some action plans to start to address those.
Yeah. One of the things that they sort of hailed when you left in Hayward was your work on the homelessness navigation center. And of course, homelessness has been something that we've heard a lot from property owners, business owners on State Street as being a problem. What is your sense of how the city's current, or the ones that you found when you came in, policies and programs about homelessness are working, and where do you see room for improvement?
Yeah, I think we're doing actually a phenomenal job. And I would say Santa Barbara's homeless population is almost probably a little more than double what Hayward's was. I think we're right around 900. Hayward was right around 400. And so, little bit bigger scale of problem here in Santa Barbara. I think our encampment response team is incredible. And then the sort of partnering with that with service providers, we recently, given the Supreme Court decision that came down, we had been waiting 72 hours to sort of do encampment cleanups and helping people transition to service providers or relocate to a different area. Now it's a 24-hour notice period. And so I think that people will see, I think, a quicker response on a lot of the encampments. We've also gotten the SURF state grant, which is going to help with vehicle encampments in certain areas. So that has just kicked off, and New Beginnings is our partner on that. And have already been really successful in outreach on some of those individuals. So that's been great. I think where the Daytime Navigation Center is a great addition. And I think that is a very similar model to the Navigation Center that Hayward had opened, except ours was a residential navigation center. So basically it was a no barrier shelter. So anyone could come in regardless of situation. And they were provided with those wraparound services. Like, let me help you in one place, find the services that you need and connect you to the different, so you're not running from the Social Security office to the VA office it's all coming to you in one place to help, because when you're in that kind of crisis situation or having mental health challenges or addiction challenges, trying to navigate the bureaucracy at each of these government buildings is, next to impossible. And so trying to bring it to a person, help them get the resources they need all in one location. And what the navigation center that we had in Hayward, it basically connected them to permanent housing. The goal was transition to permanent housing. And so we had close to a 60 to 70% success rate. We placed over 300 people into permanent housing through that program. A lot of folks would get housing subsidies to help get them get started as they transitioned into the permanent housing. And so I think the Daytime Navigation Center is a great step in that direction, but we need the ability to transition those individuals into actual housing units. And that's kind of the next step in the process.
So as a policy matter, it sounds like in terms of homelessness, you're a housing first person. I mean,
I am.
That's the theory that you go with, rather than mental health or addiction service.
Well, and I think, it's for me, there's not a broad brush, each homeless individual has a different set of circumstances. And what has been shown over and over again is people who are out on the streets, without a consistent place or consistent home, it's hard to receive mental health services consistently when you're potentially relocating, going from place to place outside. Whereas if you're in a shelter or in a temporary housing unit or even in a permanent unit, it is so much easier to get you the services you need when you've got that stable place to be and to be able to receive treatment.
Yeah. I mean, there's just been such an extraordinary amount of public money spent on this $24 billion state report, at a time when, oh, well, the population of homelessness has only increased by 30%.
Yeah.
That there is a lot of frustration, I think, with the public there.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest gap is actually housing. So even if someone has entered services, entered a treatment center, where do you put them? Like, there's no place for them to go. And so I think that's the other part of the conversation, which is how are we producing housing or mental health beds or whatever it is that is needed for these individuals to get off the streets permanently or longer term.
Yeah.
And that's just what's missing.
And then, of course, you have all of these state requirements now about housing, about how many units we have to, and so on and so forth. And I think there is some concern, because Santa Barbara is a special place, a unique place with its, very special historic and aesthetic
Mhm.
design criteria. How does that fit with suddenly putting all these units other? And then secondly, it's just the cost of housing just keeps going up. It's not like, oh, well, if we build all this housing, it's going to be really affordable. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of your general thoughts on the whole housing thing in terms of addressing it by building many thousand more units?
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting is like I feel like the state government has forgotten that actual local governments don't build housing. Like that's not like that is a private sector job. And so, but like it's this like, it's an ecosystem. And so the state has cut budgets, which has impacted local governments. They've, through ERAF and property tax shifts. So then we're like, well, okay, well, we need to impose impact fees and these and permit fees and all these other things to make up the gap for what we don't now have from our property tax revenue because the state's now shifting that to schools. And then it's like, then developers are saying, oh my God, it's, so expensive per door because local governments are putting all these fees on. It's not just like saying build all these housing units. There's so much more involved in terms of regulations, like CEQA reform that we could spend a whole hour just talking about kind of the conundrum that is development. I think it is interesting now because there's this sort of push-pull in the community and different priorities because we've got this desire to build housing so that people can live here. And it's not just capital A affordable housing. It's housing. I mean, it was a challenge for me to find housing. I don't know if I'm going to be able to buy a home in Santa Barbara. And I know a lot of our workforce who are well paid, find it really challenging to afford a place to live in Santa Barbara. And so I think that creates its own, and doctors and like trying to find a vet in town is, because there's a shortage of, these professions that we need in our community because they're like, we can't afford to live here. And so so we need this whole range of housing, and I think it's a bigger long-term sort of community values conversation because we also treasure the way this community looks and feels, the architecture, the historic nature, and sort of I think that's the disconnect between the state is this like, well, this mandate, like you must build this many housing units. And it's like, okay, but then like let the community decide how that happens. And the builder's remedy is obviously a prime example of the controversy that creates. It's like, you know, did the state delay comments back on our housing element just to kind of,
Right.
they did it. Yeah, did it in other cities is like feels like a little bit of penalizing communities. Like we're gonna let this builder's remedy thing come in, and a lot of communities around the state are now facing challenges with these builder's remedy projects that just really don't match with the character of the community, sort of have challenges from, an environmental standpoint. And so it's a complete disconnect from reality. And I think that's been a little bit of my frustration with Sacramento when people get up there and they forget what it means to actually be in a community.
Well, it just feels, I mean, they're trying to usurp local control over planning and zoning issues even.
Hmm. Hmm.
Is what it feels like sometimes. All right. Well, you've been so generous for your time, but I gotta ask you just real quick, a lightning round here.
Yes.
Downtown housing, the big piece of it is this alleged 500 units at Paseo Nuevo. Where are we on that? Can you just update that?
Sure. The city attorney and I are actually in weekly project management meetings with them. They are working on their proposal because the city owns the ground lease. It's a complicated deal, and there's a lot of financial implications as a result of that. They are trying to figure out what makes financial sense for them. I'm hoping we will have something publicly to share with the community kind of December, January, February timeframe. They're in kind of the final feasibility stages of what their proposal is going to look like. And so we'll be hopefully bringing that back to council to get that moving forward.
Yeah, I like the way you did that. Yeah, December, January, February, March, April.
Well, we don't control it. It's kind of in their court at this point, in terms of what's going to work financially for them. So yeah,
You may have done that once or twice before. No.
not my first rodeo.
All right, what about now Measure I? There's you
Yeah.
got the sales tax increase. We have the $7 million shortfall in the budget. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how likely it is to pass? What if it doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a sort of a critical path, sort of critical juncture in Santa Barbara. I think the opportunity that comes with that additional, revenue allows us to preserve services, but it allows us to also potentially invest in, some additional housing programs, homelessness response, sort of preserve our library services. And so to me, it's a critical piece of kind of the puzzle for Santa Barbara moving forward. This community has been facing the same challenges that a lot of cities around the state. That we are not the only one that has a sales tax measure on the ballot this fall. A lot are looking at that. And insurance costs, just as benefit costs, employee costs that are some of which we don't actually control, that those are set at a different level, state level, and through the pension system. And so there's a lot of those costs that are just continuing to escalate. And obviously coming in, I'm incredibly like getting into the weeds on the budget. We are going to bring in an outside financial advisor to do a peer review of our forecast. I don't think it's going to change much. I think I feel confident in our staff and the forecasting that's been done. I do think there is a significant ongoing structural deficit that we need to address. But I do also think it's valuable when you come in new, get a fresh set of eyes, someone who specializes in this, kind of what are our like assumptions, just refining everything. And so that's going to be, I think, a really important piece of the puzzle. And trust me, like we're not just going to like pass this sales tax measure and start adding positions, like really looking strategically in the organization. Where do we need positions? Where don't we? How do we continue to create efficiencies in the organization and reduce costs or programs that just we aren't using anymore?
Of course, there is a cohort of cranky old people, I name no names, who might, say, well, we had Measure C just a few years, and yes, that was for capital, but maybe people don't make that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to people who say, oh yeah, and they'll be back in 2 or 3 years with another sales tax?
Yeah, no, I think that this will actually put us in really sound footing, I think, with Measure C. The other thing that we need to remember is with the Dwight Murphy Park and the police building, which is why Measure C was initially passed, 25% of that revenue just comes off the top for debt service going forward. And so we basically lose a quarter of the Measure C revenue that has been going into capital projects. But I think that, this will put us on really sound footing. I think there's a lot of other conversations in the community, but I don't see the city coming back with another sales tax measure anytime soon after this.
Yeah. And then when you talked earlier about a possible infrastructure district downtown, that formulation would be separate from Measure C, though, correct?
Absolutely. And it does not impact property owners. It's not an assessment on property owners. It's not an assessment on businesses. It is purely, we're looking at what our so if we redevelop more businesses and properties on State Street, that hopefully generates more property tax for the city. And then we take that anticipated future property tax and we leverage that as, to basically bond so that we can put infrastructure improvements in.
I see. Okay. And then Josh and I had moderated a couple of city council debates recently. And one of the big issue was rent control. Of course, Prop 33 is on the ballot statewide, which would give local governments more power over that. Have you ever worked in a community with rent control or had, experience of it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Hayward had sort of loose rent stabilization, and we had a 3-year community conversation about our program. A lot of really interesting programs that we put into place, a mandatory mediation program if rents were increased above a certain level. There's obviously, we can't impose strict rent stabilization or strict rent control on a certain number of units. That's why Prop 33 is on the ballot. And so I think there's, I think there's a fundamental disagreement on whether rent control actually works. And so I think if what the goal is tenant protection and helping people, there's a lot of other programs that we can look at. We're going to be having, I know Councilmember Snedden, Councilmember Oscar, and Alejandra Gutierrez have been they've formed a housing ad hoc crisis committee, and we are going to be doing a community meeting October 14th to kind of bring some ideas forward and do some dot voting exercises to sort of see where the community's appetite is for a variety of different solutions around the housing crisis. And so that'll be a really interesting data point in terms of kind of what is the community's appetite, both tenants, landlords, nonprofits, and sort of getting all of the stakeholders in the room to have that conversation.
All right. Well, Kelly McAdoo, thank you so much. I mean, I got a zillion other questions I could ask you, but
I'm happy to come back. So just let me know.
That would be great. The mayor comes on every 6 weeks or so, and I'd love to have you on, a couple times a year at least to discuss these things. And you've certainly obviously brought a lot of energy, I think, to City Hall. And we see things moving that have been perhaps stuck for a while. And so welcome to Santa Barbara. Welcome to Newsmakers. Thank you so much. And we'll be talking to you soon.
Great. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.